So anyway, this is me. I'll talk a bit about me because I'm an egotist and I like talking about myself. It's the only thing I'm an expert on. That's my email address. Do feel free to copy, do anything you want. And that's my Twitter handle. I'm not calling it X. Twitter's still pretty modern for me. I'm not going beyond that. But feel free if you want to take photos of anything, I do. If you want to post them, whatever. So I really liked in the beginning that the journey around the night sky, Uranus was mentioned. So of course, one of the things we're going to talk about presently is the discovery of Uranus. Not that much actually, because I don't think in the grand scheme of what Herschel did, even though it's the thing he's remembered for, I don't think it's all that important. I in fact think it was a marketing stunt more than anything else, which I will go on to explain. I'm going to, during the course of this, I'm going to talk about all the things about the Herschels, plural, which really interest me. Now, when I've done this talk a few times in the past, I have played the music, but it tends to become a bit of a distraction. We will talk about Herschel, the composer. He was a contemporary, essentially, of Joseph Haydn. And interestingly, it's often been wondered, did Haydn ever meet Herschel? Haydn was a much better composer than Herschel, but let's put it this way. Not casting aspersions, there may be a genius composer in the room, but between all of us, we couldn't have written what Herschel did. His music, I think, is beautiful. And on Spotify, there are a couple of Herschel recordings. They're very much pieces of their time, but I really like them. So if you've got Spotify, please have a listen to Herschel. He's one of these all-round clever clocks, or was at least. So what are we going to do tonight? I should just start with giving an apology. I think Pierre has seen a version of this before. I first gave this talk about 4 or 5 years ago in a previous job. I used to work for the Institute of Physics. And my audience then was teachers. Are there any former teachers or teachers in the room tonight? Great, fabulous. So I'm sorry, colleagues. There are going to be times tonight you're going to be thinking, what has this got to do with me? I don't care about this. There will be some things which you will sense are distinctly classroom based. So why do I talk about this? I think the story is fascinating. I really do. But it goes beyond narrative. It goes beyond just a story, because I think this gives us an opportunity to think about the history of science generally, to think about scientific biography. I'm going to, at various times during the next hour or so, probably go off on, trips of wild fantasy and rant about things. And one thing I'll probably rant about is scientific biography. In fact, I'm going to rant about Ernest Rutherford in a couple of minutes. And issues I have with scientific biography. And if tonight, one of the things I achieve is to get you to question when reading history of science, history, astronomy books, a few of the underlying assumptions, I'll have done a good job. I'm very interested, increasingly so actually, in the broader picture of the history of science. When I started having an interest in the history of science, like I say, I'll talk a bit about Rutherford in a moment. It was really about the person, the events. That was it. Now I've gone beyond that, and the Herschels shine a light on some fascinating elements, some quite worrying elements. We're going to talk about some difficult topics later on about the late 18th century and British society, and where did the money come from? So I think this talk has got something for everybody, whether it's astronomy, you're interested in physics, education, history, culture, whatever. There's something there for everybody. And the Herschels were quite unique. And as I've said at the bottom, apologies if it leans a little bit on the physics, astronomy, education element. So why am I doing this? Let me tell you a bit about me. So I started off as a physicist. My degree's in maths and physics, my doctorate's in particle physics. And as an undergrad, I studied the history and philosophy of science. I gained an interest in the history of science because of this man. Not that I knew him personally, but Ernest Rutherford, of course, of local fame. I remember reading, I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I read a biography from the school library. And I was just hooked on physics biographies because it was the story of this superhero of science. And at the time, that's what I wanted. So over the course, then I had the usual sort of physics obsessions. I read everything about Newton, everything about Galileo, and everything about Einstein, but all about the people. And that's later on caused me some problems. So I've had this interest in the history of physics, astronomy, and maths since I was in my early teens. I'm one of those sort of kids. And it then brought me on to other interests. So music is one of my passions. The very fact that Herschel was a musician, he was a music teacher, he was a composer, also just rang a bell with me, which makes him an even more interesting person. You know, we all know the stories of people like Einstein, who was also a very, very good violin player, and he's not the only one. And I think one of the features that elevated the history of science for me is I found in the classroom, it gave me such opportunities to explore ideas. At the moment, in the brave new world of education, which is post-2010, awful take on what education is, they use the word hinterland when talking about interesting stuff that the kids will like. It's not hinterland, it's the real deal. It's what science is about. It's about the past. Physics, astronomy, mathematics are rooted in a history and a heritage. And I think it's really important that we know these stories so that we can contextualize. Just a little aside, one of the things I believe that puts people off, especially physics, is it comes in these big books. Now, the best book ever written on physics was by two people called Nelcon and Parker. Best book ever written on physics, but by God, it's intimidating. Now, the problem is, I think, with the conversation around science education, it is more often than not presented as a fait accompli. It is a piece of perfect knowledge. What the history of science does, it shows it as a human pursuit with real people, with real personalities, with lives, with loves, with loss. And those are so important. So these were the issues for me. When I was reading about Rutherford or Einstein or Newton or Galileo or any of these people, they always come over as lone geniuses. I read a book recently about the mathematician and all-round clever clogs, John von Neumann. And in that, he comes over as a lone genius. Books on Richard Feynman, same thing. It's nonsense. None of us exist in a vacuum. And to even imagine that even Newton or Einstein lived in a world immune from influence is bonkers. But I think that that places a barrier between us as mere mortals and the greats of science and culture and whatever. Makes it unattainable. Doesn't talk about the rest of life. And the rest of life, I think, is fascinating. Einstein, for instance, was a fascinating human being. A word of warning about Albert Einstein, though. If any of you use the like of LinkedIn or any other social media, you will often find quotes attributed to Einstein, inspirational things, 95% of which Einstein never said, and I keep challenging them and getting people to take them down. I ask for a reference. They can't give it. They take it down. But it fascinates me where science sits in society and in history generally. You can do it from Copernicus running forward to the Manhattan Project and beyond. None of these things exist in a political, social, and cultural vacuum. And this is one of the stories I think is really fascinating about the Herschels. The other, interestingly for me, 18th century obsession I've got is another scientist with lots of, well, with genuine local connections. I'm from Nantwich. Well, I live in Nantwich. I'm not from Nantwich. Anybody here from Warrington neck of the woods? No? Well, one of the local sort of Cheshire type of heroes is Joseph Priestley, you know, best known for Fizzy Pop, Oxygen, but he lived in Nantwich, and he fascinates me in a similar way that Herschel does, because they were amateurs, basically. The other thing that Joseph Priestley did, just on a Nantwich front, the first ever classroom physics lessons were taught in Nantwich. So for anybody who's got influence with the Institute of Physics in the room, I want a statue in the middle of Nantwich of Joseph Priestley with an electrical machine. So I'm just really fascinated by everything to do with the history of especially physics, maths, and astronomy. So why the Herschels? I think their story's fascinating. They're non-traditional. I mean, there wasn't really such a thing as a traditional scientist before the early 1800s. In fact, William Herschel's son, John Herschel, may be seen more in the frame of a traditional scientist with the education he had, with going to Cambridge and so on, and all those opportunities. But the Herschels were definitely non-traditional. I'll tell you a bit about their biography later. I love the fact they're musicians. They were immigrants. It's a great immigrant success story. They're actually, Herschel was a genius. William Herschel was a genuine intellectual giant. And I'm going to talk about how he learned English later on. I challenge any of you to learn German in the same way that Herschel learned English. But the scale of their impact, my God, they revolutionized not just astronomy, but I believe, I need to write a paper on this. I believe they revolutionized the whole concept of scientific organization and collaboration. And the other thing is this, they seem nice people. I don't know most of you, so I'm not going to swear, but there are a lot of scientists out there who seem to have dubious parentage, at least in the way we might refer to them. Whereas the Herschels just seem really nice folk. William Herschel really cared about his sister and his brothers and trekked backwards and forwards to Hanover to rescue them from a very challenging mother. So that's what attracted me to the Herschels. I should also say, I lived in Germany for quite a long time. And the fact that I used to visit Hanover, which is where the Herschels were from, quite a lot, and drive past the scene of a battle I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, that also attracted me. How am I doing? My God, I've already talked for 10 minutes and told you nothing. So we're going to do this in 3 main sections and 2 little sections at the end. I'm going to talk about the lives, all biography. I'm going to talk about the science. I'm going to talk then about a bigger contextual picture. Then I'm going to do 2 things which may strike you as being a little bit peculiar. No, one of them isn't peculiar. I'm going to show you some photos that I took when I went down to the RAS library, which was just one of the best days out I've ever had, sitting in a library, but it was brilliant. I collect stamps. Okay, don't say it too loudly. I'm a philatelist. I'm going to talk about Herschel and stamps, because Herschel's on stamps, and I love the fact. Right, let's get cracking. The lives. This comes really from education, what I'm going to say, but I recognize that through my own teaching, through my own personal experiences, many of us struggle imagining the past. If I ask you now to put in your head the image of somebody from 1760, some of you are there. Some of you are there going, no, can't do that. I can't do that. I can't see pictures in my head unless somebody gives me a picture. It's called aphantasia. Can't do it. And I recognized as a teacher, when I was trying to get children to understand the past, I had to give them pictures. So I do the same thing with adults, because basically your wiring doesn't change when you're an adult. If you can't imagine things as a child, you can't imagine things as an adult. I can't. So I like this context. So I'm going to show you some pictures in a few minutes to give you the visual reference. And also the things like the music. He would have been listening to Haydn, no doubt about it. He conducted Handel. So I like to be able to listen to the same things he was listening to. I look at the pictures. So let's go to Joseph Wright of Derby. Very, very famous painter. You'll all have seen many of these paintings before. That's Joseph Wright in the top corner. He's always known as Joseph Wright of Derby, which seems to mean that there's probably a Joseph Wright of Macclesfield and a Joseph Wright of Congleton and Stockport and everywhere else, all painting pictures around the same time, just to avoid confusion. I suspect that these Georgian painters used to meet up and say, what's your name, Joseph Wright? Where are you from? Well, I'm from Derby, to avoid confusion. But I think these are really helpful because it shows you things to do with dress, even things to do with lighting. It may seem trivial, but I think we are so accustomed to certain light levels. These people lived half their lives in the dark. So that's why I put things like this in. And this is a cracking film. I'm sure many of you have seen this. I watched it again quite recently, not because it's a superb bit of Alan Bennett, but because of William Herschel. William Herschel, as you're going to see in a few minutes, was actually employed by George III. His family, though, a lot of them, they were all musicians. And his nephews were in Queen Charlotte's orchestra. Queen Charlotte was the queen of George III. That, in the film, is Queen Charlotte's orchestra. If that was true to life, some of those would have been the nephews of William and Caroline Herschel. Hence the fact when I was watching this, I was watching it on my computer and I freezed it and I did a screenshot and I put it in. But that says to me, this is what they were wearing. This is what they would look like. And they play some pretty peculiar instruments as well. So that should give you some visuals. Now, the next bit on the screen of this size is going to be awful. If any of you are teachers or interested, you are very welcome, by the way, to this presentation. You can have it. The reason I say that is this one's, if you see it close up, it makes a lot of sense. If you're at a distance, it's a blur. But what I did, I actually constructed some timelines of people. The red timeline is William Herschel, born in 1738, died in 1822. And we've got his brother Alexander, the unknown Herschel, who's staggeringly important in this story, who went from 1745 to 1821, the remarkable Caroline Herschel, who went from 1750 to 1848, William's son, John Herschel, 1792 to 1871. But I've put some of the other big names on just to center it. So for me, interestingly, you've got William Herschel. When he started his interest in astronomy, you had people like Joseph Priestley was active. Henry Cavendish, the man who discovered hydrogen, who thought his sister was made of glass. Interesting neurodivergent character. Very strange. Utter genius. Essentially one of the people who helped weigh the earth, doing remarkable things with a thing called a torsion gauge. You've got Charles Messier. Charles Messier is really important in the Herschel story, because essentially the Herschels would go through his catalogue and make it look redundant very, very quickly. And then to me, the greatest mathematician of all time, Leonhard Euler. But right at the beginning of Herschel's life, look, it's when Edmund Halley died. Whereas at the other end, you've got the great James Joule being born, the great mathematician, William Rowan Hamilton, and so on. So I like this. It puts to me everything in context. The Herschels, let's have some pictures. This is one of the most famous portraits of William Herschel. Not any really great portraits of Caroline Herschel, unfortunately, but these are the three. Friedrich Wilhelm, who is anglicized to William, Johann Alexander, who is normally called Alex, Carolina Lucretia, Caroline, and what we're going to focus on mostly is William and Caroline with a little bit of Alexander. There are predominantly two locations we're going to discuss. Bath, up to about 1781. And after that, Datchet, Windsor and Slough, which you could throw a tablecloth over the three of them. They're close together near Windsor Castle. The first part of the story is all about William. Caroline doesn't become significant really in the story until the move to Datchet, Windsor and Slough, but then she becomes extremely significant. To blow up that timeline, I just want to point out some important things about William. William's life, interestingly, overlaps very nicely with the reign of George III. George III is very important. The Hanoverian royal household is important in the history of astronomy. They're enablers of astronomy, and that shouldn't be underestimated. So you can see that George III was on the throne from 1760 to 1820, which almost coincides with when William really got interested in astronomy. He was already interested in astronomy down here. He was reading about it. And when he moved to Bath in 1766, I think it was, he was already interested in astronomy, but he started writing things down here in about 1774. And he started publishing. He had a heck of a publishing legacy, 40 years worth of papers. So I felt that that was worth just including, because I'm going to talk a little bit now about William's early life. So William was born in 1738 in Hanover. Hanover is an interesting city. Hanover is the place where the great mathematician Wilhelm Leibniz lived, the chap who along with Newton invented calculus. And he was very much a son of the army. He went to school in a local garrison school. His father was a musician in the Hanoverian Guards, his father Isaac, and his education, the garrison school in the 1740s wasn't going to do too much, probably, other than teach them some basics of German and some very simple basics of numeracy. I wouldn't even like to call it maths. But his father was really interested in everything, in music, because he was a musician, in maths and in languages. He was a Renaissance man who was limited by his opportunities in life. So we can now see that at the age of 14, the young William joined the Hanoverian Guard, and he played one of these things. It's called a hautboy. It's a pre-runner of the oboe, and he also played the violin. Now, he was in the army for about 4 years, and this bit I think is remarkable. Because, of course, the House of Hanover was on the throne in England, you can essentially say that Hanover and England were joined together. They were joined at the hip, and so forces that were normally from Hanover would come to England. And in 1756 into 57, he was stationed in England. I think he was in Kent somewhere. Well, I can't quite remember where. And he taught himself English by reading, now it was either Hobbes or John Locke. Now, if you've ever tried reading either Hobbes or John Locke in English, well done. I tried that. When I was an undergrad, I thought I ought to learn this stuff and gave up on page 2. He, on the other hand, is a German, and he learned English from that. I challenge you to learn German from reading Heidegger or one of the German philosophers. And unless you're a genius, and you're going to fail, that's how he learned English. It's absolutely staggering. Then the 7 Years' War started. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of the 7 Years' War for a very good reason. I know nothing about the history of the 7 Years' War, except I'm assuming it was 7 years long. But importantly was the Battle of Hastenbeck. Now, Hastenbeck is a small village on the outskirts of Hanover. And he was a musician there. Now, the musicians in this army also used to be stretcher bearers and so on. The story is that when the cannonballs started flying and the musket balls were flying, Isaac Herschel informed his son the best place to be was behind a hedge. With him on that, this is what it looked like. So there's Herschel hiding behind a hedge with his hautboy. Let me out of here. Again, I find the pictures really useful because this is actually what the young Herschel would have seen. He would have seen people looking just like that, rather dandy, surrounded by mud, blood, and whatever else. But the Hanoverians lost this battle quite catastrophically. And so as a consequence, Isaac essentially sent William and Jacob packing, do a runner, desert. And that's what they did. They cleared off to Hamburg, got a boat, went to London. And from that moment onwards, Herschel never lived again in Germany. He did go back to Germany, but he never lived in Germany again. And he ended up in London. And bearing in mind, at the time, he was still in his teens. But from that moment, he started exploiting his musical knowledge, playing the organ, leading orchestras, composing. And he spent 7 years just roaming around the north. I was in Sunderland recently. God, he must have had quite a grim time. Richmond's lovely, I should say. Sorry, if any of you are from Sunderland and I've insulted you, forgive me. The part of Sunderland I was in wasn't the nicest. But that's what he did. He went around the north of England, giving music lessons, composing and so on. He was a jobbing peripatetic music teacher. I imagine he had a big plastic box like peripatetic teachers do and going around dealing with the offspring of the wealthy. However, during that time, he got bored. You know, he didn't have YouTube and he didn't have all these things. So he read books and he read astronomy books and he read physics books and maths books. He read a book about the physics of sound. He was a musician. He wanted to know about sound. But he read books on basic astronomy. I'm trying to remember the name of the chap whose books he read, but he read books about making telescopes. And this is how he occupied his time. Rather than reading the scandal novels of the day, he concentrated on academic study. Then he had the opportunity of a really good job. So in 1766, he went from Halifax to Bath as the organist of the Octagon Chapel. The Octagon Chapel is right in the middle of Bath. It's no longer a chapel, it's a restaurant. You can go in, if you're ever in Bath, you can go in, and it is, surprise, surprise, it's an octagon. And he was making a living from all sorts of musical exploits while he was there. He was giving lessons, he was performing, and he brought his sister over in 1772, initially to look after him, and because she was a singer. And she used to perform in Bath as well. William would conduct her. And what they did, they made most of their money. They were well paid. They were not poor people during the season, the time at which the idle and the wealthy would go and kick their heels in Bath, whilst, well, I will get into some of the political elements probably later on. Importantly, they lived at various properties in Bath, but this is the key one, 19 New King Street, which is where Uranus was discovered. Again, so let's have some pictures of Bath, contemporary pictures. And again, I think this is really useful. These are the pump rooms in Bath where Caroline Herschel would have sung. So that, put that in your mind, that's what Caroline Herschel would probably have looked like doing the evening job. And these are the places where the Herschels would have spent their time and how they would have appeared. They would have looked like just like that, and they would have visited these places. I think this one from Humphrey Repton in 1784 is the closest contemporary image I could actually find of what life in Bath would have looked like. And some photos I took in Bath. So this is 19 New King Street with the authentic van in front of it. If you get the opportunity, if you're ever in Bath, it's a wonderful little museum. It is fabulous. I'm going to get all gushy about a piece of glass later on. This is the garden where Uranus was discovered. That is a really important location. Here lived William Herschel. I should say here lived William and Caroline and Alexander Herschel. Mr. Herschel's oratorio concerts. So it would cost you 5 shillings to go and see William Herschel. And there we've got him again, conducting Messiah with Miss Herschel. Caroline was singing in the Messiah. That's one of her dresses. And this is the living room that they lived in. I love having these pictures. He taught guitar. I'm a guitarist. My guitar doesn't look anything like that, but he taught guitar, he taught spinet. This is inside the Herschel Museum. He had a passing interest in refractors. He generally treated them with, who here uses a refractor before I say something rude about refracting telescopes? Okay, they're marvelous. He didn't like refractors, basically because of the size of the lens and getting good quality lenses in the 1770s was very, very difficult, especially wide, large aperture lenses. They're very expensive, very difficult to grind. Okay, let's talk about astronomy in Bath. And then very quickly, we'll talk about Datchet and move on to the science itself. By 1772, he was obsessed by astronomy. He would put astronomical societies of the 21st century to shame with his level of obsession. He was building telescopes left, right, and centre. He bought this book, A Complete System of Optics. I think the chap was called Owen who wrote this. He wanted to make telescopes. So he started off with refractors. He bought his lenses from Dolland. That will ring a bell with some of you. Dolland and Aitchison, the Dolland in there were lens makers and microscope makers in London in the 1700s. The first one in the family was, I think, John Holland. It was actually his son who was making the lenses for William Herschel, but it's a very, very old tradition. His brother Alexander came over. Now, Alexander's the unsung hero because he was technically proficient. Bit of a clever clogs. He was skillful. He made the things. In 1774, William opened his first observing book where he wrote everything down. And by this time, he was making all sorts of things. He was making telescopes left, right, and center. Him and Alexander were making their own mirrors from speculum metal. I always forget them. There was silver in there. I'm guessing mercury was in there. I can't remember in truth the composition of the alloy. But basically, because silvered glass mirrors didn't yet exist, mirrors were polished metal. So he was making them. The problem being they tarnished as well very, very quickly. So rather than having one single objective mirror, he had to have lots of them and keep removing them and keep polishing them and renewing the surface. But he used to make his own. In the basement at 19 New King Street, you can actually see the place he used to melt down the metal and cast his mirrors, which apparently require large quantities of horse dung. Because no, seriously, I think you use the horse dung as a moulding. You use it like you use plasticine, not one for the grandkids. We want some more Play-Doh, Grandad. Oh, we've got some horse dung. It's good enough for William Herschel. And he was making all sorts of sizes of telescope. Now, I should say that when I talk about the Herschels, when I talk about a 5-foot telescope, I'm talking about focal length, because there some of you are thinking, 5 foot? I've got a 14-inch reflector and I think it's good. They always talked about focal lengths. So he had a 5.5 footer, 7 foot ones were often his favorites. He sold a lot of those, and he built a 20 footer. And there was a really important occurrence in 1779. He wanted to look at the moon. And just because of the vagaries of geometry and the earth, from the back garden, you couldn't see the moon. So as you would, he took his telescope into the street. You know, that would even look a little bit strange now. But in 1779, here you've got William Herschel with a 10-foot long tube in New King Street. And a fellow called William Watson walks past, fellow of the Royal Society, starts having a chat to him, invites him to join the Bath Philosophical Society, which still exists, and ultimately gave him the opportunity to communicate. In fact, it's during this time he made discoveries. He observed the variable Mira, and that was his first paper, which William Watson communicated to the Royal Society. And of course, in 1781, in March, he discovered Uranus. So after the discovery of Uranus, now this is where we have William Herschel, the self-publicist. He wanted to call it the Georgian star, bearing in mind it was the first planet discovered ever. Everything else had been known from antiquity. And he reckoned it would be a good idea to name it after the king. King likes that. Thinks, oh, I've got a planet. Never mind that fella in France. Well, I've got a planet. So what he did, he offered Herschel a couple of £100 a year to move to be not the astronomer royal. That's quite important. He was essentially an astronomer at the beck and call of George III. So that when George III had his chums over, and after a rich dinner at Windsor, they said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to go and have a look through a telescope. Let's all pop over to William Herschel's. And that's actually what was happening. He was on call to the king. So when he moved to Datchet, this is when probably he built his most important instrument, which is the 20-footer. That's the masterpiece. That's the one where I believe he revolutionized science. It was obviously it's a big piece of kit. He built a 40-foot telescope, which had a lot of promise, but never really delivered. It was too big. In fact, if you go down to Greenwich, they've got part of the tube of that outside because he built it with iron, whereas the other ones were built with wood. And apparently it was just often too heavy to hoist. 1788, William married Mary Pitt. 1792, John Herschel was born. John Herschel in himself is a fascinating character, both in terms of astronomy and the history of photography. Caroline. Now, Caroline is not well remembered, or not well remembered enough by history. She is seen often as simply William's amanuensis, but she's so much more. Initially, she did enable William to do astronomy. But what William did apparently was he purposely, whilst they lived in Bath, developed her mathematical skills. But she made the decision when William was offered that £200 a year from the king. She could have stayed in Bath, but she threw it all in with a brother, went to Datchet, and essentially became a professional astronomer in her own right. She did sweeps. We're going to talk a little bit about sweeping later on. And what she used sweeping telescopes, which is, let me tell you now, I will come on to it, but now's a good enough time. The Herschels observed the sky in two ways. They were the great surveyors of the sky. That's what they really were there for. Once they did the discoveries of Uranus and some various moons, which we'll talk about, they then wanted to do systematic studies. And they did it in two ways. Initially, what we call horizontal sweeping. Essentially, they got the telescope, popped it up like that, and let the Earth do the hard work. Okay? There's a problem, of course, with that. It's pretty time-consuming and laborious. So then they moved forward from 1786 and said, well, let's do the smart thing. Let's do that. So when I show you a picture of the 20-footer in a minute, you'll be able to imagine this. It was on runners. So they hoisted it up to the top and down it went. And as it went down, they let it jiggle about a bit. So they didn't just get the static field of view, they wobbled it. So it oscillated a little bit. So it just increased the field of view. And then they let it go all the way down to the bottom. The Earth has obviously moved. So in fact, you're not doing a real vertical sweep, you're doing that. And then they lift it back up. And depending on the speed at which they dropped the telescope and lifted the telescope, it determined whether the sweep bands were like that or whether they were like that. And they did all of these. They actually in total did 1,118, I think, sweeps. But Caroline is well remembered for discovering comets. I think she discovered 8 in total, using quite a small telescope. She just knew the sky so well. And this is the bit that's staggering. I'll show you some pictures of this later on. She overhauled Flamsteed's great catalogue, but she was so much more. So Caroline Herschel, of course, as a woman, was not allowed to be a member of the Royal Society. She couldn't report directly. So this is her report of a comet, which had to be given to the Royal Society by Charles Blagden because she wasn't allowed to do it herself. This is a cracking book if you're interested in John Herschel, but I like this statement. Caroline's contributions to astronomy extended far beyond simply being an assistant and amanuensis to William. It was Caroline's careful calculations and organization that turned William's observations into useful astronomical knowledge. Right, how are we doing? Right, so I reckon I've got about half an hour, 35 minutes. Let's look at the science. So there is so much science he did. As I said, most people remember him for Uranus. Uranus is going to get a sentence in about the next 10 slides because I think Herschel is so important. Him and Alexander made the best telescopes in the world. This is why he milked the Uranus thing so much. I don't think he massively cared about Uranus. He was a businessman. He recognized his telescopes were the best in the world. When the Astronomer Royal of the day came to look at his telescope, he recognized it was far better than anything they had at Greenwich. And he made them for people and he sold them. So you can see here. And this is, I'll show you the reference for this later on. But these are who he sold some of his telescopes to. The King of Spain had a 25-footer. Which a replica has been built of this in Spain, and he charged him £3,150. Now, I know how much some of you have probably spent on telescopes in the 2020s, and that you think, oh, blimey. So you can imagine 240 years ago spending £3,000 on a telescope. And didn't even get a CCD or anything clever. But you can see various people. That must be a different Francis Drake, because the other one that we all know about was well dead by then. And we've got people in Denmark. Bode, you know that name, don't you? The great Bode, as in the Titus Bodlor. And you've got other people down here. The Empress of Russia was the proud owner of a telescope, and the Emperor of Austria. Any other interesting ones on there? She had two of his telescopes. Piazzi. Does the name Piazzi ring any bells? Piazzi was one of the discoverers of one of the earliest asteroids. I can't remember which one, but Piazzi is up there in the name of people who discovered early asteroids. So there's some important people on there. He even sold his friend William Watson something. Mr. Pitt. Yeah. I don't know whether it's the senior or the elder. My political knowledge there is weak. So he made the mirrors, they ground them. But I talked earlier about the other unknown people. It wasn't just him and Alexander making these things. You need other craftspeople. You need woodworkers, metal workers. This industry was employing people. He wasn't able to make all of the fine metal parts. He bought them from people. There was an extended supply chain. So he used Uranus, no doubt about it, as a door opener for his own business. And in his collective works, you will find lots on telescopes. Here's just a note. The first 20-foot telescope was a 12-inch mirror. The second 20-footer that he built, 18-inch. And when he built the 40-inch telescope, it had the 40-foot telescope had a 4-foot mirror. You know, I'm not going to go into the physics of telescopes and supporting mirrors, but that would have been a heck of a thing to try and support. It would have been bending in no time. So probably that helped consign the 40-footer to the dustbin of history. So this is a 7-foot Newtonian. This is a replica. So you can see all the parts on it. He didn't make all these. These required the local supply chain. But this is a perfect replica of one. There's a similar one in the Oxford Science History Museum, which is on the High in Oxford. But you can see there, obviously, the secondary mirror, and there's the eyepiece. That is the 12-footer, I think. He had to climb that on a ladder in the dark. It's incredible. Could you imagine the paperwork? When I was a school head teacher, I used to have to get my teachers to go on a course called Working at Heights, to stand on a desk and put up a poster. Herschel, on the other hand, would clamber up this in the dead of night in the back garden in Bath. That's the 20-footer. 20-footer is really interesting. Just to do a little bit on telescopy here. And I'm going to talk about, on the next slide, in fact, what's called the Herschelian orientation. He used these in two different formats, the 20-footers. One standard Newtonian, but he also had his own orientation. And I'm going to show you my Herschel telescope later on. I haven't brought it with me. I've got a photo of it for you, so some of you like that. The 40-footer was Herschelian only. What does that mean? Well, it means this. You didn't have an eyepiece at the side. You didn't have a secondary mirror. Secondary mirrors complicate life. So what you do is you actually just peer into the tube. And what he actually did was hold the eyepiece physically himself at just the right place and just peered into the tube. And that's how the Herschelian orientation works. Cause loss of light. When you've got, bearing in mind that in this day and age, when you've got any telescope, the secondary mirror, they're good mirrors. But speculum really does taint quickly. So these were not necessarily good mirrors. Removing the secondary meant you got more light transmitted. Now, for the really great stuff, systematic studies. Well, the sweeps. He knew Flamsteed's catalogue. He just knew it. So he was able to go through the sky on these sweeps, and he was communicating with Caroline by shouting across from the telescope to a window. And Alexander had created a system of pulleys and wires and bells that when he had something to say, he would ring a bell, Caroline would open the windows, he would shout across what he'd seen, where he'd seen it, she would write it down. He'd use reference stars from Flamsteed's catalogue, and that's how they did it. One of his earliest catalogues were double stars, and he found loads of them. He found optical doubles, and he found genuine binaries. He never achieved what he wanted to with optical doubles. He recognized that if you've got optical doubles, you should be able to see parallax. But his telescopes were never good enough to detect parallax. But he found optical doubles, he found genuine binaries. He also, I'll talk about proper motion later, but his work helped confirm proper motion. He went well beyond the solar system. Messier, what was it? 100 and how many? 4 Messier objects. Do we stop at M104? Well, he went to 2,500. He just knew the sky. It's really quite incredible that he was able to, and he published these in 3 catalogues. The challenge is, if you ever have a look at Herschel's work, to actually understand the catalogues, because he doesn't use RA and DEC. He used his own systems initially. So the star catalogues were phenomenal. As for the solar system, 13th of March, 1781, he observed Uranus. Thought it was a comet. You're going to see it for the first time. It's an object. He'd have noticed it had moved. It actually required the maths of Anders Lexell with subsequent observations of Herschel to fathom out it was a planet. Then other things. So 2 moons of Uranus, Titania and Oberon. Actually, with the new 40-footer at Slough, on almost his first night of observation, he found 2 moons of Saturn. He wrote papers on Mars, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, and the Moon. He observed asteroids, confirmed they were moving, and as far as I can find, he's the first person to use the word asteroid. And I'm going to talk about heat, light, and the sun in a few minutes. And as for comets, well, they were the masters of comets. And these are all taken from their papers. So there we can see Saturn and moons of Saturn. And this one looks like the discovery of the moons of Uranus. Now, this bit is fascinating for me. I think he really helped create real cosmology, not speculation, but tried to do something physicsy with it. And he did a thing called star gauges. So he made this really clever assumption. Science is peppered with having to make credible assumptions. And his assumption was this: if you look at a patch of sky and you look how many stars are in a certain area, he was saying, I reckon they're distributed lengthwise. So the more stars there are in that area, probably the deeper the field is. So if you only saw 1 or 2 stars in an area, he said, probably the field isn't that deep. If the stars, there's lots of them, they're not all here in space, they're going to be spread out and stacked up. And from that, he deduced that the distribution of stars with us at the center was that. Now, people get this wrong. This wasn't him saying this is what the Milky Way looks like. This was a distribution of stars based on his star gauges, but that's stunning that he was actually able to do that. And I've got an image, I haven't got it here, it's in another reference. But this actually corresponds reasonably well to a slice through the Milky Way at our location. Look. Clever. 1780s. He wondered about nebulae. He wondered if nebulae what they were they genuine clouds? He wasn't in a position to recognize that some nebulae were gaseous and some were stars and some were galaxies. That was beyond his imagination at the time. And he actually thought that the appearance simply depended on the distance. You remove an open cluster. So let's deal with Pleiades. If you're looking at the Pleiades, his assumption would be that's quite near because I can see lots of stars. You then look at something like the Andromeda Galaxy. He couldn't see stars. It must be a long way away. It's milky. So that was his logic. And he coined the phrase planetary nebula, including the Saturn Nebula. He did quite a lot, you know. He did more. 1780, some of his earliest observations, variable stars. This was clever. He knew the sun was moving through space. So what he was able to do, he was able to approximate by using proper motion measures, where the sun was moving, how fast it was moving, and in what direction. So Halley had already shown proper motion of 3 stars by using star information from the ancients. Halley knew there was such a thing as proper motion. Herschel took it to the next level. This is the sort of thing that really excites me, because he was then thinking of an evolving universe, that gravity was the agent of change. And then later on, he was doing a lot less. He was doing a lot less astronomy by then, but in 1802, his work essentially showed that real binaries existed, because he'd been observing these stars since the 1770s, 1780s, and going back to them. And he was looking again at his doubles and seeing that with the opticals, obviously they were not moving, but with others, he was getting a shift. So it's likely as well he discovered binary stars. Now, this is my favorite, because this is me, not as an astronomer, me as an astrophysicist. Because in 1780, he discovered infrared radiation. He was looking at glass and lenses and working out how sunlight heated them up. If you go around observing the sun, your lenses are going to warm up, and he wanted to know how light was affecting the temperature of the glass. So he started doing experiments. And on this one, so he took a prism and he's got thermometers, and he was measuring the heating effect across the colors of the spectrum. And then he did one of those marvelous things that physicists do from time to time. He had some good fortune and he measured beyond the visible spectrum, and the thing warmed up even more. He discovered infrared radiation. That is astrophysics. Now, physicists in the room, I defy you to look at that and not go black body. That blows me away. The axis runs in the other direction, red, orange, yellow, and so on. A black body graph would be flipped around, but he's measuring the temperature rise as he worked across the spectrum. I think that's utterly brilliant. That would have got him a Nobel Prize now. And that's the prism he used. When I saw that in the museum in Bath, I had one of those wobbly moments as a physicist. I thought that is the beginning of astrophysics, because that's the beginning, not just of measurement of position, that's the beginning really of measurement of properties. That is in the museum there. It was loaned to them by the Maritime Museum at Greenwich, but he used that to discover infrared. Now, let's see, I've got 20 minutes. I'm going to crack on. There's another really interesting approach. You've got William Herschel and you've got Caroline Herschel. Nowadays, those papers, of which there were dozens and dozens, all of which just said William Herschel, would now say Herschel William, Herschel Caroline, Herschel Alexander. But what they did, they were the first version of the likes of CERN, because they did raw data observations. They recorded, they reduced the data. They dealt with numbers, they reduced them. They did the maths on the numbers. They analyzed them. In the case like of the star gauges and the cosmology, absolutely. And they drew conclusions. That is the whole picture of the scientific process. So I think that they were also at the forefront of real modern science. 1800 is a pivotal moment. Not only did he discover infrared, but around that time, plus or minus 10 years, they created an approach to modern science. So there was so much happening. They were processing data. They were designing telescopes, manufacturing them, using them. All three Herschels were involved in the work that they did. They were a proto-collaboration. It's just a real shame that it's only William's name on all the work, because actually all three of them should have their name. If you ever go and have a look on the internet, there's a website called archive.com, which is a place you can go and find astronomy, astrophysics, physics papers. And even back when I was doing particle research 30 odd years ago, you'd have 400 authors on a paper. You've now got papers with 1,000 people, and even in astronomy, you've got dozens and dozens. Herschel just had his own name, but he was right at the beginning. Let's do a little bit on the bigger picture. I think I'm just about on track to finish in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to sort of go off the astronomy and go more into the history and the culture, because this really interests me. Because it's all very well thinking that, you know, the Herschels were phenomenal scientists. But how did that happen? There must have been something that allowed it to happen. Why did that happen in England in the 1770s, 80s, 90s, and so on? All sorts of things. There had to be an alignment. There are historical conditions, scientific, cultural, economic, geographical, so many things happening all at once, which permitted it to happen. So let's just have a quick look at the historical context. George III, that unification of Hanover and England, vital. It allowed Herschel to move. It allowed Alexander, Caroline to move. The fact that King George III was a Hanoverian, and he's got a Hanoverian astronomer wanting to name a star after him, I think that's really important. We saw that sort of thing, that patronage, going back to the likes of Galileo. Galileo experienced this with the Medicis. Galileo couldn't have done what he did without the Medicis. In the same way, I suspect William Herschel couldn't have done what he did without the House of Hanover, that royal patronage. And so you've got all these things going off, changing the world, the 7 Years' War. And during the time, you know, we're talking the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and all the French Revolutionary Wars. All of those are happening, during which time we see the growth of British naval power. We see, I think that probably the Industrial Revolution is coming up on a later slide. But all of these things are pouring essentially strength and wealth into England and into Hanover as well, creating these opportunities. What about the time? Well, if we roll back to Newton, Herschel is observing 100 years after Newton invented the reflector. What we've traditionally called the Enlightenment was probably coming to an end. We're about to enter the Romantic era, even though I think the Enlightenment is still merrily rolling on. But you've got that Newtonian clockwork universe, a universe which needs to be described by science, by mechanism, not by superstition. You've got the back end of the great experimentalists, including Newton. You know, Newton was fascinated by light. He published a book called Optics, after all, in, I think, 1727. You had scientific learned organizations bringing scientists together, learned people of the time, and allowing them to communicate, not just within the country, but importantly, networks across Europe. The great scientists from the mid-1600s onwards actually communicated across Europe with no boundaries. It was remarkable. So they had access to a much wider network. We also see we're at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. Steam was already about. The quality of metalworking, Derby had already smelted iron with coke by then. We've got improvement in metal production, in crafts and so on. Clockmaking. I bet many of you in this room have read Longitude, all about Thomas Harrison and the clocks. So clockmaking had become really, really good. For clockmaking, you need incredible precision engineering. Those tools and those skills were there, the things you need to build telescopes. Oh yes, I've mentioned John Harrison there. So all of those stars aligned. Commerce. I'll just quickly run through them. You know, this first, well, there's actually a steam engine before Newcomen, but the first proper commercial steam engine would have been Newcomen. But through that time, the wealth of the nation is growing. And what happens when you get wealth? You get disposable income. When you get disposable income, you get money available for people to learn musical instruments, to go to concerts, to go to Bath for the season, to provide the environment precisely into which William Herschel landed. He was a product of his time. 100 years earlier, there'd have been no place for that musician, William Herschel, to go. I believe that the social and historical conditions around Bath at that time made the Herschels, the scientists, actually possible. Just a few things in case some of you are interested, just to give you some cultural context. Writers, you've got Samuel Johnson, Lawrence Stern and Robert Burns. Across that century, you've got Handel, Haydn and Mozart as well across that century, as well as architects and painters. So that scientific progress, I think, requires quite a few things. It requires preceding science, this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants, absolutely. He needed Flamsteed's catalogue. He needed Newton's wisdom for building reflecting telescopes. Politics, conflict and empire. We've got a German living in England. That's only possible because of what happened in England with the accession of the Hanoverian monarchy with George I. We've got the culture, the art, music and literature, which again in Herschel's case was really important. Commerce, geography. So, you know, why do all of this? I like the fact that now I look at Herschel in a very different way. I think about this as Herschel being embedded in history and culture. He didn't just happen. It wasn't something random that just happened in time. All of the greats of science, just as the greats of art and music and literature and so on, are products of their time. They may form time that comes after them. Time, the future then becomes products of these great people, but nevertheless, they have to be products of their time. And so his work is really rooted in the history and the culture of the 1700s. The other reason I like this, I just like knowing about the real lives of these scientists. I want to know what they ate. I genuinely do. I think it's important to understand what they ate, what they sat on, what they wore. I think the reason some of these people were so active, the seats were so uncomfortable. They just always wanted to be on their feet. I should say this actually, and I meant to mention this when I talked about infrared. When you look at Herschel's papers, he did those as an experimental physicist, not as an astronomer. So his astronomy really was, he was an observer. He was an observer, then an interpreter of data. But when he did the infrared experiments, they were systematic studies, and they really were systematic. He was altering one thing a little bit, doing all his measurements again. It's brilliant physics. And I think it's important looking at that bigger picture. You know, it wasn't just 3 Herschels who did all that. I talked about him doing the sweeps. Well, that telescope tube didn't magic itself from there to there and back up. It had fellas pulling on ropes. It had woodworkers. It had all sorts of craftspeople enabling this to happen. There was a big, as I said earlier, a big supply chain. And they had lives and they were all involved in that science. I'll just quickly say this for those, I know that 3 of you in the room have got interest when it comes to education. I've used regularly this sort of stuff over my teaching career. Not Herschel, I have to say, because my interest in Herschel grew after I left teaching. but you can see the links to science, music, art, and history. In this one, you've got the solar system, the spectrum, optics. I'm going to show you a telescope. Oh, I know. Oh, we're an astronomical society. Yours a telescope. Bet mine's better than yours. And obviously links to cosmology. And I love the fact that one of the key players in this is Caroline Herschel, who shouldn't be she should be at front and center of the development of astronomy. I'm going to show you my telescope. Brace yourselves. That's my telescope. Wow. Oh, that's a Herschelian telescope. It's a plank, it's a shaving mirror, and it's a lens. And it works. That's the roof of the house behind where I live. I did this to show to some teachers. I was actually doing a bit of work on optics with some teachers. And I thought, I wonder if you can actually easily make one. And I was staggered. And it does work because, of course, with all the way in which optics work, you do pop your head there. It doesn't get in the way of the mirror. And you can see it. And that's a Herschelian telescope in Herschelian orientation. That's the nearest I've been to a telescope for donkey's years. I'm not allowed telescopes anymore. Over the years, I've had quite a lot. And my wife has lost all patience. I had a beautiful Dobsonian at one school. And I got to a point where I wasn't allowed to bring it home because the dogs kept running into it. You couldn't put it anywhere. The bug was huge. It was truly magnificent. So I've been banned from buying telescopes. But my wife tolerated a plank of wood. So I'm just going to show you some references. I'm going to talk a little bit about these for a couple of minutes. If you read it, if what I've gone on about for the last hour or so tonight interests you, there are some really good books you can read. These are the collected papers. These are brilliant. What staggers me about them, they're so well written. The earliest papers in there are over 240 years old, but they read so well. If you ever attempt to read, so I'm fascinated by the history of science. I try to read papers from hundreds of years ago. Some of them are impenetrable. These read beautifully. But you can access most of these through the Royal Society archives. They photographed all the transactions of the Royal Philosophical the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. They've all been photographed and they're all available through the Royal Society if you ever want to look at them. The Herschel Chronicle was compiled, I think it was by his granddaughter, and essentially it's their diaries. Fascinating reading. But if you want the best biography, Michael Hoskin is fabulous. I love this book. That's my favorite book, Discoverers of the Universe. But recently, the goodly Wolfgang Steinecker, who is a wonderful chap, wrote this opus magnum. It is that thick. It's only on astronomy. It doesn't talk about infrared, and it is the most detailed account. I think I've bought one. I think only sold 3 copies, and I own one of them. It was a labour of love for Wolfgang. Some very good books on Caroline. In fact, if anybody heads to Nantwich in the next couple of days, there's a second-hand copy of this going in the Oxfam shop for a couple of quid. That's okay. That's a very good book. But Michael Hoskin is the one. And again, if this stuff really interests you, there are 2 other things. There's the Herschel Museum in Bath, which I just love the place. It is truly wonderful. They've got a website. And I'm a member of the Herschel Society, which celebrates all things William Herschel and the Herschel family, the music, Caroline, even a couple of the members of the committee are great-grandchildren of William Herschel, which I think is great fun. Now, let's see how I'm doing for time. This isn't bad. I'm going to do about 5 more slides. This is the encore. I'm not going to go off and then come back on. I'm just going to do the encore. So this is roughly what I used to do just as the talk. But I do have this peculiar thing. It's no surprise, really. I'm a physicist, mathematician. I collect stamps. Nothing unusual about that. Herschel's on stamps. So the first time William Herschel appears on a stamp is in 1970. And it's this. So in 1970, the Royal Mail issued a set of stamps celebrating various organisations that were all celebrating anniversaries. This was the 150th anniversary of the Royal Society. This is a cracking picture. William Herschel, John Herschel, William Herschel holding the Georgian planet and its satellites. That is the 40-foot telescope. This is a chap called Francis Bailey. Does anybody know who Francis Bailey is? Has anybody heard of Bailey's beads? That's Francis Bailey of Bailey's beads fame. They set up the Royal Astronomical Society. He was the first president of the Royal Astronomical Society. I love that stamp. I think it's a beautiful thing to actually have. I have a collection of science and maths, well, physics, maths, astronomy stamps. And this is one of my favorites. However, I'm now going to show you my favorite stamp of all time. Oh, you can feel the tension mounting in the room. And it's this from 1990. I love this. It is beautiful art. I've got this on, I've got the postcard of this and the stamp as well framed on my office wall. Why do I love this stamp? Well, it's got Newton and Herschel. So there we've got Newton's reflector. But here we've got, look at that. Now it does say Milky Way. I'm not comfortable with that because it's not really the Milky Way, it's a slice. But we've got his cosmology and we've got his telescope. And look, we've got a bit of Principia type stuff here as well. I think it's a beautiful piece of work. There are 4 stamps in that collection, including Stonehenge's on one of them. But I think that is fantastic. So that always, I think that's glorious. Let's have a couple more. So then we go to astronomical objects. I think the Royal Mail realized then it was quite a cheap and easy thing to bang on some pictures of space. So they did that in 2002. Now, this is where you're the astronomers and I'm the astrophysicist, right? My own research in astrophysics just uses numbers. You don't look at anything. You get lots of numbers and you play about with computer programs. It doesn't require going out in the dark or getting cold. It requires the ability to deal with Python programming and writing computer code. That's stuff. You talk to an astrophysicist. I don't know if any of you are astrophysicists. You are, and you're astronomers as well. Forgive me. But most of the astrophysicists I know go, what's a telescope? The first Herschel object on there is the one in the top right. Herschel discovered that. So in his catalogues, and especially in Wolfgang Steineker's book, what he does, he maps all of Herschel's discoveries to NGC numbers and modern names. So that's NGC 7742. So that's the first object that Herschel discovered that's on a stamp. Then we go to 2007, the Sky at Night set. This is great, this is, because it's all Herschel, I think. So we've got the Cat's Eye Nebula, discovered in 1786. Herschel found that. Then we go to the Spindle Galaxy. That's that one. Herschel discovered that, 1787. We then go to the Eskimo Nebula, that one. I wonder if you can guess who discovered that. 1787. And then the Saturn Nebula. I just think that's lovely. The Sky at Night stamps 2007 are actually celebrating not just the sky at night, which is well worth celebrating. There was an interesting chap, was Patrick Moore. I once had dinner with Patrick Moore, and it was a very strange experience, as the meal consisted of him and his opinions about Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, lovely chap, decidedly bizarre. But anyway, I love the fact that those are all Herschel. Then we've got 2020, we've got the Cat's Eye Nebula again, and then Enceladus, which he discovered. And we've got some artwork there. I think that's it for those. So I just love the stamps. So I'm just going to do one more thing, and then I'm going to shut up. So I've realized, I told you I could talk for 15 hours on this. I'm trying hard not to. A couple of years ago, so again, I imagine quite a few of you in this room may be members or fellows of the Royal Astronomical Society. It is the most wonderful place. And being a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society allows me to go in their library and demand things. And so I was working down at the Institute of Physics, and don't say a word. I sort of used my time at the Institute of Physics and toddled off for a day instead of spending my time at the offices in Caledonian Road, and tipped up at the Royal Astronomical Society and said, show me what you've got. So in the morning, I looked at a first edition Principia, which was beautiful. I looked at a second edition Copernicus, De Revolutionibus. They didn't have a first edition. I looked at a first edition Kepler, first edition Galileo, and they let me take photos of all of those things. And then in the afternoon, I said, can I see Herschel's papers? They said, yeah. So they let me get my hands on William Herschel's work. This is Herschel discovering infrared radiation. Honestly, as a physicist, this is one of the highlights of my scientific life. These are his measurements of temperature on thermometers. And he's talking about visible red light and so on. And this is his work. And they're all there. They lay them out on this huge pillow so that nothing gets damaged. And they're talking about here the thermometer number 1 rose by 6.5 degrees in 10 minutes. Wow. I just was in awe. And I sat for an hour just turning these pages and looking at the birth of astrophysics. And then they showed me the star. This is their star catalogue, their Flamsteed's star catalogue. This writing is Caroline Herschel's writing. So they made, where they were discovering new objects, those are new objects drawn in pencil. So these are their new discoveries. The numbers are what Caroline was classifying the objects as. So these are obviously known to Flamsteed, but here, new discoveries, observing stars or other objects that had never been seen before. It's remarkable. It's a huge book, this is. And there's Orion. I just feel that is remarkable. And you can see everything on there. There's even some bits of writing on here. And there's writing on every page of this. I've actually got photos, I think, of every single page. But throughout it, you can see the writing of of William, of John. And there is on one page a particular note, because John Herschel was apparently, as a child, fascinated by, somebody tell me, please, what's the fancy name for the constellation that's the whale? Cetus? Yeah. There's a little comment on there for John Herschel about Cetus, and it's the whale. He liked the picture of it. And there's a comment in the margin. So honestly, for me, that was such a highlight. This fellow whose work I'd been really studying for, must have been 5, 6, 7 years by then, and getting to see this stuff. So if you ever get the opportunity, go in the Royal Astronomical Society, make an appointment, and the librarian will let you get your hands on this remarkable stuff. Anyway, my friends, I've been talking for 1 hour and 20 minutes. I'm going to stop because I need a drink, and that's it from me. I'm talked out.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Very entertaining, very informative. A certain chairman who isn't here today would love the Herschelian telescope.
Jolly good.
I think we're going to have to make one here one evening, don't you, Jason? And I know there's another person in the room who has far too many telescopes and whose partner would love to get rid of them. So you're not the only one. Has anyone got any questions from tonight's amazing talk? Jason.
I just wondered if you don't mind. First
Oh, wait a minute.
Just wanted to know if you could put that in a little bit of context for us. So how much would have been understood at the time? What's up? Sorry? Oh, really? Okay. As far as I mean, parallax and things like that, when they were measuring that, was it Bessel who
Yeah,
was doing
I think
that?
it was.
What sort of year would that be? Would Herschel have had any idea of how far away stars were? I mean, would he have any idea of that the sun was actually a star, or there was a connection there?
I think, I mean, ultimately, when it comes to to that, I suspect he did realize the sun was a star. As for parallax, after all, really one of the downsides from Copernicus onwards was the fact that parallax itself couldn't be observed. So the knowledge of parallax had been around, or at least the expectation that you should be able to see parallax had been around. I think that all that Herschel could have done with it is recognize that it set a lower limit on anything that he could have done, simply because parallax was still unmeasurable at the time. So what I guess it would have done, not that I've read that he did this, but he would have been able to estimate the minimum distance.
So he would have
of the near-
recognised that these things were immensely far away.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. The
Was
very
that a-
fact
was
he
that
did the
a goal
star.
of his then to
Sorry.
try- was it a goal of his to try and establish
Yeah.
distances and things?
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things that had been recognized by a chap called John Michel is that if you've got optical binaries, after all, you would there, because essentially if you've got an optical binary, it does the same job anyway of normal parallax, I guess, but you've got two objects, and he was hoping that because they're optical binaries between over the 6 months of the Earth going around the sun, that would give you the parallax. So it was already known by John Michel. And I think I popped that on the slide. I think it's mid 1700s, maybe the last third of the 1700s. So certainly Herschel would have been aware, and that probably was a motivation behind the double stars catalogue. The actual binaries probably was a happy discovery more than anything else in about 1801, I think. So
Those
yeah.
big long focal lengths would have been perfect for binary systems and things like that.
Oh,
wouldn't they?
perfect. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks, Rick. So when was Bessel? When did they actually discover that? Do
You know, I
when was it?
can't remember. I've got in my head Bessel's 1820s, 1830s.
so
I could be out
Herschel-
by 20 odd years.
Herschel wouldn't have been alive to actually get that information then. That's a shame, really, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, cheers.
Thanks for that talk, Mark. It was absolutely fantastic and
Thank you.
fascinating, and I really liked the way that you structured it and pulled it all together with the context of all the stars that aligned, if you'll forgive the pun, that led to all of those led to what he did. But I just wondered, there were two things that struck me about all of that, and that was one, the technology that allowed him to build the telescopes, which then enabled him to see further or with more clarity or than anybody else had. But I was wondering if you could quantify that, given those two things, most other regular people would have looked through the telescopes and seen the night sky, but him and his sister had the capacity to actually catalogue the night sky and make the discoveries. How rare were their qualities, and that they were siblings? And I just find that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know if it can be quantified. I think what can be said is, firstly, when it comes to the technology, I think it was less about technology and more about the manual skill that they had when it came to the workmanship in creating the mirrors. That was the key bit. They were better than what anybody had made. The amount of time and effort that especially Alexander Herschel would have put into polishing those mirrors and getting the shape as good as possible to remove any aberration whatsoever. In terms of a family affair, I'm not aware of any other collaboration of that sort. Now, even going though back to the mid 1600s and the formation of the Royal Society and so on, you had collaboration. You had Hooke and Boyle working together at the Royal Society, but they did it as a job. This had the family connection. They were all on completely the same page, and I think that those bonds were absolutely the crucial thing when it came to that. And I do feel that it was also that just the right time when people had developed other technologies which are incredibly accurate. The lens making, people like Dolland was making the best lenses in the world. So Herschel could have the best eyepieces in the world. So coupling that with the best mirrors, you get the best telescopes. All those things just coming together at this one point in time. Let it happen.
The other thing that I find fascinating is, I'm sure everybody else does, but Simon and I and Pierre and others in the room do astrophotography. Just the idea of looking through an eyepiece, but then having to transpose that onto paper without having an image to capture it from a camera. I mean, how on earth did they even do that?
I think it goes down to the sheer quantity of observations he did. He would typically spend 10 hours on the telescope. So I was actually I went back last night because I just wanted to check a couple of things. I wanted to check the number of sweeps they did and all of this. And they did 1,100 sweeps, and some of those sweeps took 10 hours to do the lowering and raising over and over again. So I feel what it was, he just had a phenomenal knowledge of the night sky in a way that, because the great thing was that the season in Bath meant that over the period of the winter, I don't think he had a great deal to do. And it was dark early. And I imagine life in the 1770s in the middle of winter in Bath was none too glorious as it would have been anywhere in Britain. So he looked through his telescope.
No clouds.
There would have been one or two. But if you can imagine the skies would have been pitch black. Yeah. So he had that opportunity. Cold nights, occasionally cloudless. Absolutely, completely dark. So I think he just got to know the sky so well that when he saw something, he was able to go, oh, that's different. I've not seen that before.
Maybe even a photographic memory or something like that
Wouldn't
as well.
surprise me, because he had to communicate them. So the way that he communicated them, as far as I know, to Caroline, was he would pick a known object from the Flamsteed catalogue. So he must have known the Flamsteed catalogue. And then he would talk about how far away it was. And he would talk about in terms of like the field of view. He wouldn't be talking about it in degrees and so on. It's just this amount of the field of view, to the left, to the right, up, down, and so on. And then she would be popping things in the catalogues. So that's how they were doing it. I think they just had the most phenomenal knowledge of the night sky. I bet that at number 17 New King Street, when they packed up the cart, they went, bye, don't come back. You're welcome.
Anyone else want to say anything? Carolyn.
As an ex-Brummie, can I please plug Birmingham? It has a statue of Joseph Priestley, where he lived for some time,
He did, and fled.
became a dissenter, and there were riots. They burnt down his house and he had to flee.
And off he went to Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
After that.
So, yeah,
But
he's not only in Nantwich, he's
but also Leeds. So I think there's a statue of him possibly in Leeds, and there is in Pennsylvania as well. But because he taught the first physics lesson to children in Nantwich, and what annoys me about this is the place he did it, they demolished it, and there was a block of flats on there. Now it's an eyesore. But Priestley was a truly remarkable person in so many ways. He was another one, and he's on the same page as me for Herschel, in that he was a genuine polymath. He was a remarkable human.
yes, he was a free thinker. Do you think they had a grid on which to estimate where the stars were? That's what we do in microscopy.
More than, well, there is.
I mean, on his eyepiece or something?
Not that I know of. I know they certainly were used later, but I don't think he did. I think using crosshairs and micrometers on eyepieces, I think may have come later, but I'm not certain about that. But I don't think he did. I think he simply based it on his knowledge of the field of view.
Anyone else? Yes, okay.
I'm just intrigued about the telescope making, because I mean, they must have been pretty good engineers. So the big long focal lengths, Would that mitigate them having to parabolize mirrors and things like that, or were they doing that? Were they using Foucault operators, or was it to test the sort of surfaces? I mean,
As far as I know, those mirrors, I'm not, I have asked the question myself about whether they were parabolas or spherical. My gut feeling is they were probably spherical, but they formed them over molds.
right.
And just down in the basement, those molds, they somehow use straw and horse dung and all these things to pour speculum over.
Yeah. So they
so-
would cast them and then grind the surface,
Yeah.
just like you do. I have actually did an 8-inch mirror, and I can't even imagine how they have that much time to do these things because it takes forever.
I mean, the difference,
Uh,
of course, being
yeah.
here, though, that whereas with lenses and mirrors nowadays, we'd grind them.
Mm,
These won't really think you ground so much as they were cast metal,
right.
and they were polished.
I see. I
So
see.
they would have been able to manipulate them somewhat into
Yeah.
shape.
They must have still had pretty good services, though, I guess.
Oh, they would have been just the best. I think I feel you've actually got to put a lot of this down to simply the technical and artisanal skill of Alexander,
Right.
because he is the unsung hero of this whole piece. He was the man in the basement with melting all these metals and casting the mirrors.
And are there any left? Do you know?
Yes, there are.
There are
Oh
the
yeah,
ones left, yeah.
they've got them in the museum.
Right.
They're pretty tarnished,
Yeah.
but yes, they still
I'd
exist.
be intrigued to know how good they are.
And yeah,
Yeah.
some of the little ones are still about.
Right, but some of those that you were talking about were a fair size, weren't they? They were like 14-inch.
Well, his second 20-foot focal length telescope had nearly a 19-inch
Yeah.
mirror. And of course, the problem is, and they had multiple mirrors.
Right.
Because now, we buy a telescope, the mirror's there for life. These tarnished really quickly, so they had to be able to take them out and put clean ones in.
Yeah.
So they were constantly making mirrors.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much.
Welcome.
I'd love to go there. Yeah.
It's well worth the visit.
Absolutely. Right.